everyone, glad you're here with us again this week as we continue our lesson series on the book of Matthew. Now we have gotten up to Matthew chapter 8, still talking about the ministry of Jesus. And what we're going to be looking at today is a teaching that Jesus gives in response to two individuals that approach him. So if we go to Matthew chapter 8, beginning in verse 18, it says, "Now when Jesus saw a crowd around him, he gave orders to go over to the other side," that'd be the other side of the sea. "And a scribe came up and said to him, 'Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go.' And Jesus said to him, 'Foxes have holes, and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head.' Another of the disciples, followers, people that were in the crowd, said to him, 'Lord, let me first go and bury my father.' And Jesus said to him, 'Follow me and leave the dead to bury their own dead.'" Now Jesus is teaching something here that many Christians are really not interested in adhering to. And Matthew seems to be teaching that there are two primary barriers that will prevent people from being willing to follow Christ: our comfort and our tradition. Now notice the first guy. The first guy, is the scripture says, was a scribe, and he tells Jesus that he's willing to follow Jesus anywhere Jesus went. Now we need to keep in mind that at that time the scribes were highly trained, highly sought after individuals for their skill and their abilities. They were masters of the Hebrew scriptures in terms of knowledge. And their job really was to prepare copies of the Jewish literature on scrolls. And so they spent all their time copying and preserving these scrolls. They would have studied for years to be able to detect scribal errors in the scrolls and to be able to understand the hidden meanings of the scriptures. Because of that knowledge, they frequently became teachers of the law. They were experts in the Hebrew law. And because of their knowledge of the law, sometimes they were referred to as lawyers. So sometimes in the scriptures, they will be called lawyers. And they would even be asked to argue points of the law before the courts, such as the Sanhedrin court. Now, while they were supposed to provide their scribal services freely, they were allowed to charge for their teaching and even their representation in court procedures. So they were fairly well paid for the things that they could be paid to do. In addition, most came from money. You got to keep in mind, in order for them to spend their time as a young boy training to be a scribe instead of learning a trade such as a fisherman or a builder that the family might need in the family business, they needed to have parents that had wealth and could afford to send their son to a profession like scribal school and learning. And all of this is to say that this scribe was probably fairly well off financially. So when he makes this statement to Jesus, Jesus lets him in on a little secret. Jesus didn't have a lot of money. He wasn't like other rabbis or other teachers. There's no indication that he charged a lot of money for his teachings. He seems to have given truth away freely. And that meant he didn't make large sums of money for his sermons. Now, this scribe may not have been aware of that. He probably thought Jesus was like other teachers in his ability to charge for his teaching services. So Jesus let the scribe in on the fact that because he gave away his teaching freely, for the most part, he had very little resources. In fact, Jesus said he didn't even have a place to sleep most nights. And that was no doubt shocking to the man. And what Jesus was saying is, if you want to follow me, then you also need to be willing to give all of the comforts of life up. Now, that's not to say that we will always be asked of Jesus to give up everything, but we are required to be willing to do that. So the first thing that we see Jesus teaching is if you want to follow me, you have to be willing to give up the comforts of life. Now, the second thing that we see in this passage is Jesus is saying you have to be willing to give up tradition. He says, and another of the disciples said to him, Lord, let me first go and bury my father. And Jesus said to him, follow me and leave the dead to bury their own dead. Now, most biblical scholars say that this man was not needing to bury his father right then. His father was probably still alive. However, since this man probably was the eldest son, it was traditionally his responsibility to take care of the mother and the father in their old age. This is part of the reason that the eldest son always received a double portion of the inheritance. So what he was saying was, let me fulfill my traditional responsibilities and take care of my father until he is dead and buried, and then I will follow you. Now, while Jesus does teach that we need to ensure that our parents are cared for financially in their older years, there was nothing in the law that required this man to be there physically. I mean, he could give up the double portion of the inheritance and turn the responsibility of that care of his father over to another family member, along with the inheritance, that double portion inheritance. He could give all that up to follow Jesus. His father would have been just as cared for, and the law would have been satisfied. The father would have been cared for in his old age when he was not able to financially care for himself. This is what the scripture teaches that we are to do. This man was just following the traditional way of doing things. And he wanted Jesus to adhere to the tradition before putting any requirements on him. Now, what's wrong with tradition? Tradition seems to be a good thing, and it can be. There are purposes for tradition. Sociologists have studied the benefits of having traditions. It gives us stability in our lives. Like roots that ground a plant, our traditions ground us to our family and to our friends and to society in general. Our traditions help us stay rooted and grounded. Our traditions provide structure to our lives. They comfort us and allow us to feel safe. They give us a sense of belonging. We share traditions with someone else, and therefore we belong together. Traditions satisfy that longing that we have to be together with other people. Even if a person is sort of an outsider the rest of the year, when he or she gets together with the family at Thanksgiving or Christmas, it gives that person a sense that they still belong. And research has been done, like I said, by sociologists, and it has shown that tradition helps people be happier and healthier. Traditions reduce stress. They improve our mental and emotional health. They help us manage difficult circumstances in our lives. This is part of the reason that we long for family gatherings at Christmas and Thanksgiving, 4th of July, all the times that our families get together. God had traditions even in the Hebrew text, times for his followers to get together as families, because God understands that those traditions can be beneficial to us. However, Matthew comes along and he says that if you want to be a follower of Jesus, then you need to be prepared to give up all of that. Give up that comfort and feeling of safety that we get from other people, possibly even people out in the world. So God understands the importance of traditions, and then at the same time, he asks us to give them up. Well, the idea, if you study what Jesus was trying to accomplish, is Jesus was trying to build a community of believers that would be there to replace what you lose when you chose to follow him. The church is supposed to provide those benefits of tradition to those that are in the church. We don't always do a very good job of that. But for those that have lost or have been forced to give up those times that they used to have with family and friends, we in the church are supposed to replace that feeling of security and peace and love and acceptance by inviting those people into our church community traditions. I give you a prime example of how Jesus was trying to teach this to his followers, his disciples, his closest 12. If you remember, the disciples held Passover with Jesus just before he was crucified. Now, you got to keep in mind, these disciples had family with whom they had traditionally celebrated Passover. And they may have done so in other years, but in this last Passover with Jesus, he taught them that observing these traditions with followers is actually more important than biological family. And they had to learn that being part of that Jesus community meant that they established traditions with the community. And they were going to have to provide all of those things to the converts that were coming in the future that would also be losing their traditions to become a part of this community of followers of Jesus. Things like a sense of belonging, a sense of safety, a sense of good mental and emotional health. These disciples were going to have to step in and help provide this for these new followers of Christ, new members of the church. Jesus even changed established traditions to include things like the bread representing his body that would be broken, and the wine representing his blood, the blood of the covenant. And this would now be a tradition that only the followers of Christ could truly understand and gave them a sense of belonging. This would have been so incredibly difficult for his disciples. To put it in terms that we would understand, a lot of times in the church, we have a Thanksgiving meal with believers at a different time than Thanksgiving Day, so that we can be with our families on Thanksgiving Day. But that's not what Jesus did. He didn't celebrate Passover with his disciples the night before so that they could be with their families on the real Passover night. He even bypassed having Passover with his own mother. He replaced biological family time with spiritual family time. The disciples were expected to miss out on their traditional family Passover to start new traditions with the community of believers. To understand how brazen this is, what Jesus was doing would be like this in the Church of America. If the church in America had Thanksgiving together on Thanksgiving Day, or Christmas together on Christmas Day, in place of believers spending those days with their traditional family and friends, and expecting everyone to show up and celebrate together as a community of believers. I mean, can you imagine the church in America doing that? Do you see what Matthew is actually saying? These traditions that we hold, I'm not saying we have to get rid of them. What I'm saying is we have to be ready to lose those for the benefit of the kingdom, even if that means we lose the benefit of the tradition. But at the same time, we need to keep in mind that Jesus' plan seems to be that we in the church start new traditions that his followers could observe together. We're just now starting to see a theme that Jesus is going to hammer into his followers throughout his ministry as we continue on in the study of Matthew. And this theme is, if you want to follow me, you need to be prepared to sacrifice. We can see this clearly. Jesus actually teaches this in Luke chapter 14, beginning in verse 24. He gives a sermon on counting the cost of being a follower. He teaches this for the exact same reason that he gave these answers to these men in Matthew 8. Followers of Jesus need to expect that following him costs them something, and not expect to be given the good life from a physical standpoint. There is the spiritual blessings that come with following Jesus, but physically, following Jesus is not always the fun life. Hey, I hope you all have a great upcoming week, and I will see you next time as we continue our study in the book of Matthew. Bye-bye.